I am Brady Self. I'm the Northwest Mississippi Extension Forester, and I am here today to talk with you about the next installment of the extreme weather course that were offered over the last couple of years through the Forestry Department at MSU. This particular segment is going to be basically hinged and garnered around species selection, survival, and especially drought and the influences that drought have with our planning of reforestation across the state as we move into the future. Now, if you will remember kind of some of the things that are out there, and some of the things I want to talk about as we move through this particular presentation, we're going to try to focus in on drought, but there is a lot of more variables that play into some of the silvicultural techniques that we do out there on the landscape that I'll focus in and out of as we move through this presentation, and how they relate back to what we expect things to do from a drought perspective inside of the state. Kind of an outline of what I want to talk about today is just straight out drought in the southeast portion of the nation, primarily focused in and around Mississippi. But in addition to that, kind of what we've seen out there on the national scale and where we think we're going, again, primarily focused in and around Mississippi. Then I also want to touch in on natural and artificial regeneration of forests and how we expect for drought and extreme weather to impact what we select to put out there on the landscape. And then I'll focus in and specify what we expect to see in the pine realm and in the hardwood realm as well. Now, if you think about drought, not necessarily climate change or anything like that, but drought, which can be a byproduct of some of the changes in climate that we expect to come down the turnpike. When we think about drought, it's always kind of a fluidic type situation. With right now, the world's in and we're under drought. We haven't had rain in X amount of days or X amount of months, and what are we going to do next? Where are we going to go? Everybody remembers back last fall how bad it was in Mississippi, but if you look at the nation as a whole, we were under some pretty significant drought across the south and then in central and southern California. But if you look at the rest of the nation as a whole, we weren't quite as deep into those droughty conditions, into that dry weather for extended periods of times that we necessarily were here. So drought's bad here, not bad there at the particular time. That's something that just a little bit of time can completely change. If you'll look at where we are sitting right now, this particular slide came from, actually I pulled it off of the U.S. Drought Monitor yesterday while I was putting the final touches on this presentation. If you look at where we're sitting now as a region, we're still kind of in drought, but if you look at most of Mississippi, we've kind of pulled out of that. We're talking about just a few months difference. So that's why it's really hard to nail down where we are speaking from a drought perspective across the nation, and then even more so, believe it or not, once you get narrowed down to a certain region, because it's of a lot of noise that's in the data and a lot of variables, just like on the biological side, on the climatological side, there's a lot of variables that play in that are really hard to sort through and come up with good answers sometimes to set those trend lines. If you'll look at this particular slide, you're looking at a data set from the U.S. Drought Monitor that's basically a governmental website that's maintained through cooperation with the University of Nebraska. If you look at that slide, the blue line at the bottom is percent ground that is not in drought. You're talking about ground or acreage that doesn't have any kind of drought conditions on it whatsoever against the historical average. If you look at the brown line at the top, that is the converse of that. That's the ground that is underneath some type of drought, some droughty conditions at any given point in time. So this particular data set goes back to the beginning of 2000 and goes up through yesterday. And if you look at that, there's a lot of noise there. It's hard to look at those lines and actually come up with a good idea of where we're sitting. So if you fit a couple of trend lines to that data, what you see is a slight drop. The brown line at the top, you see that goes from upper left to lower right. You'll see that particular trend line kind of sloped to the right slightly, indicating a slight decrease in acreage that across the nation, across the southeast, that is underneath some type of drought. The flip side of that is if you look at that blue line, you see a slight increase in that line that indicates that we are increasing acreage that isn't under a drought, averaged out across time. Now you immediately you think, well, that's good. We're not in drought, but you've heard statistics can tell you whatever you want them to tell you. If you'll look at that and you look at the R squared, we're running R squareds of less than 0.03 on the on one line and a little less than just barely over 0.04 on the other line. Our R squareds are very, very, very low, so we're not really fitting the variance of that data set to those lines. Our model really doesn't tell us where that variability is coming from. Translation, we don't see a lot of security in that data set and being able to predict where we are as a trend across time in relation to where we expect to be in the future with drought conditions in the south. Now, if we focus in on Mississippi, which is really our biggest concern, obviously through Mississippi State, what you'll notice is you're going to see the same exact type of situation where you enter periods of extreme drought and you enter periods where you don't have a lot of drought conditions across the state. Now, if you'll pay attention to the red, most of the states under red are either dark red, or the kind of orangey brown there. If you'll look over at the fourth column from the right, we're still sitting at 100% of the state. 100% of the acres in the state were under either extreme, severe, or exceptional drought during that particular week, which was the end of November of 2016, back in the fall. Like I said, came out of a really bad drought. But again, this is something that fluctuates. If you look at that moment in time, we were pretty bad off. People had a lot of trouble getting food plots to grow. We saw a lot of mortality in plantings that we had across the state. But you give it a little bit of time, about a month later, the beginning of January, you still see some drought across the state. In this particular slide, the south half, or south 1/3, I guess, of Mississippi, though, is completely out of any kind of drought conditions whatsoever. And if you go up to the second column from the right, you'll notice we don't have any of the state that's actually in the extreme drought category. You only have about 9% of it that's in the severe drought category. So just a month's time, we completely, I don't want to say reversed, because you do have some other things that go on out there with the soils and plant damage that's done in those drought conditions. But we entered a more forgiving, I guess you could call it, period of time from a silvicultural standpoint, in that we're able to plant our seedlings out there from a forestry perspective under conditions that are more favorable to maintain survival and growth. So again, it fluctuates. If you look at that what we expect to happen from looking at trend lines out there and from a graphical representation, I guess you could say. If you look at this particular data set, which is the same data set, it's just, like I said, it's in a graph form looking at all the categories lumped together, what you'll notice is pretty much every fall you're going to have some type of drought conditions across the state. So what does that tell us? How do you fit any kind of statistical analysis to that? And we'll talk about that just a little bit here in a second. But what you do see is every year, basically, across that 17-year time period, we have some type of drought in the fall. And extreme droughts are more severe droughts, I guess you could call it, kind of oscillating in at every 4 to 6 years, something like that. Now, what does that tell us from a from a data analysis standpoint? If you remember, I said the data for the southeast was kind of confusing. Well, if you look at the data for Mississippi, it's hard to pull anything from this particular graph. If you look at our R squareds, we're running 0.0002 across the board for both land in and land out of droughty conditions. Basically, you look at that particular slide, we can't fit anything to the data that's out there for Mississippi. Now, why is that? If you look at the the averages across the nation, we're able to kind of set a trend. Well, it's related to several other things, and I want to talk about a couple of those as we move through. But first, I want to focus in on a question that I've gotten in the past when I've done this kind of presentation, which is, well, okay, that's drought conditions as a total. But what really concerns us is drought from, those severe, extreme, and exceptional drought categories. We were in exceptional and extreme drought for most of the state last year. So what does that do for us in that particular moment? We expect to see a lot of mortality, a lot of damage to our local fauna, local flora. It comes down to we still don't really have a good data set. We don't have enough time, don't have enough data that actually enters that data set to stick a good trend line to it. If you'll look at this particular graph, what you'll notice is that same kind of spiked graph across time, that same kind of influx of really heavy droughts about every 4 to 6 years. But the interesting thing is, we're only talking about a R squared again, a 0.07. So the closer to 1 you get, the more happy you are, the more secure you are in knowing that you're being able to explain that data set. So anything less than your 0.7, 0.8, something like that is really not, we don't have a high level of confidence to that particular curve, that particular formula. The best trend line I could set to this particular data set was somewhere around 0.07. But you do kind of start seeing that, that sinuosity. You see the kind of, it rises from the early 2000s, it lowers from the early 2000s and rises back up to where we're at right now. If you stretch that data set out over time, what you start to see is that ebb and flow, and we're talking about decadal or bidecadal type distribution of more extreme droughts. So again, it rises, it flows, and we don't have enough data to really be able to say where we're at over the eons as far as drought conditions in Mississippi through data that's readily available. Some of the other things that I said I would actually mention there is, this kind of goes hand in hand. If we know we don't have drought conditions that are predictable, and we know we're going to have them in any certain time in Mississippi, how does that relate back to the temperature? What do we expect to see from a temperature standpoint? Well, if you'll look at this particular map and the little graphs that are pullouts around the map, what you notice is, for most of the nation, we saw over the last basically 2 decades, we saw an average increase in temperature over the historic normals that were set between 1900 and 1960. We saw, for the most part, we saw about 1 degree to 1.5 degrees in Fahrenheit change, a shift upwards of temperature, an increase basically. But if you'll focus in on the southeast, we kind of bucked that trend, especially Mississippi. If you look at Mississippi, we're about half and half in the categories of negative 0.5 degrees change and positive 0.5 degrees change. So basically, if you average negative 0.5 and positive 0.5, you come up with 0. So we're kind of floating there. From the southeast standpoint, we haven't changed a lot. From Mississippi and even Alabama standpoint, we've actually pretty much leveled out at about 0. There's no net change, so to speak. But what we have seen, and you'll see this particular map as a visual representation of what I'm going to talk about, what we have seen is a shift upwards in the number of greater than 2-inch rain precipitation events. Basically, I'm saying, we saw a substantial increase in the number of rain events out there in the last 40 to 50 years as opposed to history and what we have recorded there. Now, what does that tell us when we start thinking about drought, and how do we plan for drought and in our plans that we make for forestry into the future? Are we going to have drought? Odds are probably not, looking at the data set. We don't expect for drought to have an overriding impact on how we plan for things in Mississippi. It doesn't mean that that's the case in other regions, other states, but in Mississippi we don't expect to have a huge impact coming in from drought. Now, there are some other manifestations of extreme weather, things like tornadoes, hurricanes, ice storms, things like that do seem to be on an uptick. Looking at the records, depending on where you're at in the nation, but we have seen kind of an uptick in that particular type of event. So we expect for that particular factor to have a larger influence on what we do in forestry than something like drought. Now, what I want to talk about from here on out is let's assume that the data hasn't captured everything that the data should. That we do enter a period of drought. Again, we don't have enough, really speaking from a historical perspective, enough data to say what it did 150 years ago or 200 years ago or 500 years ago. We don't really know what type of weather we experienced. We have ideas from pulling pollen records and things like that, but we don't have a really, really good quantifiable handle on where we were in the past. And we don't know, obviously, what we're going to experience necessarily in the future from an issue of, do we actually expect for the climate to increase in warmth as we move forward. So, assuming that we do enter a period of time where we have increased drought conditions, I'm going to talk to you about things that we could do to plan around those types of events in Mississippi. When we think about regeneration in forestry, there's really two main approaches to take. You have natural regeneration and you have artificial regeneration. Natural regeneration is a tool we use a lot in hardwoods, and I'll talk about why in a little bit, and a lot of it comes down to expense. I mean, how much does it cost to basically recruit young seedlings and saplings up through vegetation that's on the ground after a cut if you didn't pay to have the seed put out, right? It's free. We don't necessarily expect for that to be a viable option in the case of extreme weather. If a hurricane comes in and blows down a large portion of of the South, say for instance, think about Hurricane Katrina. Back a few years ago, we saw a lot of the mature timber in South Mississippi and over into Alabama and on back over into Louisiana. A lot of that mature timber hit the ground, and we didn't have a seed source in place to be able to use something like natural regeneration. So you've seen a lot of restoration efforts down there in the last 10, 12 years trying to get some of the species back, hardwood species back on the landscape that we didn't have a seed source basically with which to draw from to try to get that recruitment on into the future. So in hardwoods, we may see a shift of the way we do things if we do get into a problem with drought in the future. Now, pine systems, that's not really a concern. Pines, not saying that you can't use natural regeneration, it will work. And historically, we did a lot of that with seed tree cutting and things like that. We actually sowed seeds too, if you go out west or even in the south in some cases. But with the genetic improvements and basically the technology that's out there now, it doesn't pay to use natural regeneration. You will actually save money through plantings when you do the economic analyses by shortening that rotation up to a point where it's advantageous to actually use artificial regeneration anyway. So we don't expect for drought conditions or extreme weather conditions to change that and make a shift back to a natural regeneration type system. Now, artificial regeneration, we're going to give you basically the textbook definition here. Basically, we're talking about the planting of trees or the broadcasting of seeds for the regeneration of forest land. Now, that's as straightforward as it can get, but you would be surprised how many people will actually overlap artificial and natural regeneration. The knowledge is there, but a lot of times people don't connect the dots and realize that there are some differences between those two systems. Planting seedlings is going to be the most common thing that we see here. We did use, like I said, seeds in the past, but we ran into some problems with that. It's never a guaranteed thing. You never expect to definitely be able to bank on it that you're going to be able to put seedlings in the ground and you bet your life against that they're going to be successful, that you're going to be able to have a successful program there. So there are ways that we guard against that. There's a lot of factors that play in that can limit your survival and subsequent growth in those stands. Anything from species site suitability, which is where a lot of afforestation and reforestation programs fall apart. Seedling quality, that's not as big of an issue as it used to be, but you still can find seedlings that aren't that great a quality in some circumstances. And then the two that I particularly favor as far as being where a lot of our problems come from with mortality in young plantations is the way they're handled and the way they're stored and the way they're planted once you actually get there to the field. Any one of those things isn't met or is met in an incorrect fashion, you're going to have a system that falls apart with mortality. Now, focusing in on pines specifically, I want to talk about those just a little bit and then we'll move on. Really, it comes down to species of choice that are out there for you. What do you want? And that's a question that when I ask, a lot of people will look at me like I'm crazy. But it really comes down to not just the site conditions, the species site relationships of whether the species is suited to the site you're trying to put it on, but it also comes down to what do you want as a landowner or an industry practitioner, or a public lands forester, or whomever's putting those seedlings in the ground. It really comes down to what do you want? What do you want out of that forest? And there are variances in growth rates and wood characteristics and things like that that make certain species more or less attractive. Now in Mississippi, we have 6 species actually of pine that are native to the state, but we only have 4 that are going to be commercially viable. And we'll talk about a couple of those. The 2 I'm not going to really go through for the purposes of this talk are going to be slash and longleaf, because we don't have a lot of that acreage on the ground anyway, and we don't expect for there to be a lot more put in as we move forward into the future. The 2 that do pop up and are typically going to be more commercially important to you are going to be shortleaf pine and loblolly pine. Now, loblolly pine is going to be our most widely planted species. I expect probably 90–95% of the pines planted in the South are going to be loblolly. There's a reason for that. We have done so much genetic work in loblolly pine over the last 50 years that we have a completely, I don't want to say a completely different organism, but a vastly improved from a commercial forestry standpoint organism, species out there that is capable of growing on a lot wider range of sites than it did historically, better growth forms, higher survival due to not being impacted by bugs or insects and things like that, and the list goes on and on. It does grow well throughout most of the state. There are a few cases where it's really too dry, and that'd be something like a shortleaf site, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it does grow on a wide range of sites, and loblolly is capable of really exhibiting some really great growth, which is why we use it. Now, there's always a downfall, right? There's always a downside to anything you do. In this particular case, we see a higher susceptibility to ice and wind damage in loblolly pine compared to something like shortleaf pine as we move up in the state. Once you get into the northern portion of Mississippi, historically that was a shortleaf pine area, shortleaf pine range, because of the ice that accumulates on those trees in the winter in some of the more traditional weather that we saw in the first half of the 20th century and in the 19th century as well. Now, theoretically, if we get into something where our climate does warm a few degrees, we do expect that range to move further north. But if we get into a situation where we have droughty conditions, we could have problems with that. We'll talk about that in the shortleaf portion here in a minute. But basically, we're looking at our cash cow, if you want to call it that, in the forestry world in the South as being loblolly pine, and I expect it to remain so. When we talk about shortleaf pine, we're looking at the pine that historically had the widest range, and not only that, it has a range that has been the most impacted of, or a coverage that has been the most impacted of all of our pines, excluding maybe longleaf pine. You expect for it to grow on really dry sites, on the tops of ridges and things like that. And basically we have converted a lot of that ground, a lot of that acreage over to loblolly pine as we made those genetic improvements or enhancements where we basically cut the shortleaf down and put loblolly back in its place in an effort to shorten rotation lengths to bump up our financial portfolio, basically. Shorter time, less time that you have to carry money, greater rate of return is what we're looking for. So shortleaf pine has been it has been kind of the stepchild, if you want to call it that, where we've seen it move out of the landscape through our impacts out there. Now we're seeing a resurgence of interest in shortleaf, primarily from restoration type efforts through things that the federal government's funding and things like that. Just not a lot of landowner interest in it right now. That said, it is still a viable option if you have really dry, rocky soils in the northern part of the state. It does have a lower susceptibility to things like ice. It has a lower susceptibility to things like drought. But again, there's always a downside. In this case, the growth rate is what most people focus in on. But it's also more susceptible to things like southern pine beetle and Ips beetle. I can't tell you if that's a product of the fact that it was on dry sites and had lower vigor because it was on those sites, or if that's something that's just indicative of that particular species inherent to it. But either way, historically speaking, it did have some problems with pine beetles that we didn't expect to see from the loblolly side. Now, I already said that it had one of the widest ranges of our pines historically. But another thing that's worth thinking about is if we do get into situations where we have droughts, we get into that type of weather condition across the south, we would expect for shortleaf pine to be maybe move in reverse of where you would expect loblolly pine to go. Loblolly pine would probably move in a northern direction, where shortleaf pine would move down into the south, where we have drier and warmer conditions on some of those ridges especially that we've tried to convert over. So we'd expect to get a large-scale conversion of loblolly to shortleaf if we get into a situation where we have serious drought for prolonged periods of time. I don't expect this to be a 1 or 2 year drought. We're talking something that reaches into that 10-year range, 8-10 years, something like that, where we would expect to have pretty substantial impacts on things like loblolly if we planted them. Now, kind of the nitty-gritty of what does drought do for us, or do against us, I guess I should say, on the pine side of the world. Assuming we put everything in the ground right, assuming we do the right type of transportation, storage, planting, get good quality seedlings, do the right type of, plant the right type of species on the right type of site, we have some pretty wide variance in where we expect for our survival to come in on pines. If you'll look at this slide, if you historically speaking, we haven't done this in 30, 40 years, but what we expected to get without doing any kind of chemical site preparation was somewhere around 40% survival year one after planting loblolly pine on the landscape. That dropped to about 20 to 30% if you had a lot of drought in that first year. So drought came in and basically halved our survival rate. Now, more so than really any other factor, chemicals, herbicides in pine silviculture have advanced that system along to a point where it's become what we're looking at now. Through just the introduction of chemical site preparation, we saw about a 2-fold increase in survival. So we went from 40% without to about 80% with. And then it's still in that 10-15% reduction under droughty conditions. Throw in a little oust in the tank, something like oust or some of the other herbaceous weed control herbicides that are available. You see about a 10% bump in survival, maybe 15, depending on the year, depending on the site, through just the addition of that herbaceous weed control, which is why you see industry going that route a lot now. And then still somewhere in that 80%, about a 10% reduction in survival if you get into drought conditions. Now, containerized seedlings are purportedly great for drought conditions. That's one of the reasons why some people plant containerized stock. And kind of what we've found is there's not a lot of difference between the survival of bare root and containerized stock. If you look at this particular, as far as survival goes, if you look at this particular slide, still running about 40% for no chemical site prep seedlings, bumped up to about 85% in chemically site prepped areas, and still running about 90% in that growing season herbicide application realm. So really, from a drought resistance standpoint, we don't expect to see a lot of benefit gained through the use of containerized seedlings in the pine world. What you do get is the ability to extend that planting window out. You can plant earlier, you can plant late, and you might think that's kind of related to drought, but it's a little different. It's not something we're going to cover right here. But you do, like I said, you do extend that planting season out both ways, and that's really where your benefit comes in the pine world. If you're planting in February, March, you might want to think about going the containerized drought, especially the later you get in the season. Now, from the hardwood side of things, when we talk about seedling survival in that particular realm, there are a lot of different species planted out there now. But what I want to do is focus on oaks, because oaks are really what drive afforestation in old fields and reforestation even in areas where they came in and did a cutover. Basically what we're talking about is that's where the money sits from the hardwood forestry standpoint. That's where we expect to be able to make the most money through our cutting. So we focus our silviculture there and hope that we get some of those other beneficial species, the light-seeded species, the shade intolerant species that blow in from off-site and give us that component to our stands. So if we concentrate on oaks, we're really talking about 4 planting stocks that are out there. They're still available. Some of them aren't used as much as they used to be. You could add cuttings if you're talking about some of the short rotation woody biomass crops and things like that. But again, we're going to focus on oaks. So really we're talking about acorns, bare root seedlings, small containerized stock, and larger containerized stock. Now, direct seeding, it's kind of like we talked about with pines, except a different take on why we don't use it as anymore. Historically speaking, think 70s and 80s, we did a decent amount, a fair amount of acreage was direct seeded with acorns through different government programs and through people wanting to try to reestablish oaks on some of those grounds that have been pulled out for things like agriculture in the past. What we found was we didn't get survival, and there's a lot of people that'll when I work in the Delta, there's a lot of people say, well, hold on, I can show you a stand of direct seeded oak where they came in and they seeded acorns, and I mean there's 1,000 trees to the acre out there right now, and they're right. There are some of those properties out there, but I kind of like looking at it like my major professor did back in school, which is my typical response is, well, what about the other 99 that are back in bean fields now? Because that's about what we ran. Somewhere in between 1% and 3% survival, or success, not survival, but success in those direct seeding efforts. They just failed. There's a lot of factors that play into that. 2 of them are going to be very pertinent and very related to this particular talk. Competing vegetation. Competing vegetation, you might say, well, that's not drought, but it is related. If you think about the amount of roots that little radical coming out of the acorn and going down through the soil profile there, you think about the amount of absorptive surface, the amount of fine root hairs that particular radical has, and you think about it trying to compete in comparison with the fibrous root system of grasses and broadleaf weeds. There's a thing called moisture stress that comes into play, and those little acorns just can't compete. They just can't maintain themselves in the situations where we have drought. So drought does come in and has a serious detrimental impact on direct seeding. If you get a great year and everything works and you don't have any problems yet, it can work, but drought is the thing that takes out a lot of those efforts that we've made in the direct seeding world. Also, seed quality. You're only looking at the best seed sources, about 65, maybe 70% germination. You're also talking about predation. Anything that eats, that's out there in the wild, is going to eat an acorn. We're talking everything from small, neotropical, well, maybe not neotropicals, small songbirds all the way up to turkeys, deer, raccoons, skunks. I mean, you name it. Everything that's out there on the ground will eat acorns. So unless you get them to a certain depth, you're going to have problems with just herbivory of those acorns after you plant them. You'll also see things like weevils. You lose a lot of the crop to insects. A lot of the mass crop in any given year goes to acorn weevils. So there's a lot of factors that played in that kind of knocked direct seeding out on us as we tried to use that in our systems out there. So what we came to in the 90s, think early 90s through about the beginning of some of the federal incentive programs, things like Wetland Reserve Program and Conservation Reserve Program, things that have put a lot of oak back on the ground in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. What we see now is 98% or better of the afforestation that occurs, or the reforestation that occurs, is going to be done with 1.0 bare root seedlings. And there's lots of factors that go into that of what makes a quality seedling, but we don't have time to talk about that today. You can find that information out. But you still run into the same problem that you do that I mentioned kind of briefly with pines, of species site selectivity. Hardwoods are very, very site specific, and if you don't match those species to whatever site conditions are out there, you will meet with failure. It happens over and over and over. If you go back to some of the work that was done in the 70s, basically elevational changes in river bottoms of as low as 6 inches will completely change the suitability of any given site for an entire assemblage of species of bottom and hardwoods. So it's very, very, very important that you match those species to your site, and you don't just go with one species monoculture from one side of a field to the other, or the same thing for a cutover. Now, I want to show you a picture of what I mean by that. If you'll look at this particular photo, what you're going to see is in the, along Highway 8 there, the north half of that photo, you'll see a fair density of trees out there. This entire island, if you want to call it that, that goes between the river and the highway there, was planted in Nuttall oak back multiple years ago. The only difference in that site, there's no soil textural difference. There's probably some slight textural difference. There's no soil series difference, and that's a whole nother talk. There's no species difference. There's no planting timing difference. There's no no planting stock differences, no cultural differences. When this was planted, it was all planted from road to river in one species, which was Nuttall oak. I'm sorry, water oak. I said that wrong. It's actually a water oak stand. Now, when you get down closer to the river, you see really, really quickly you lost something. And what you lost was survival of your trees. Pure and simple, the survival difference right there comes from inundation, and not just inundation, but soil saturation. Basically, that river comes up, it flushes out, it goes back down, but those soils stay saturated for a long period of time, and water oak isn't capable of maintaining itself down on those wetter areas. You think about it being a wet-ish species, but it's not capable of handling this type of soil moisture. Now, if you had gone in and planted a couple of different species and matched them to those lower elevations, you probably would look at a different scenario right now with that particular stand. You see this across the delta, you see this in the hills even. It's just a situation where we try to bend Mother Nature to do our will, and it just doesn't work. If you don't pay attention, you will wind up having plantation failures. Now, if you'll go back to the previous slide here and look for a second, there's one other thing I do want to focus in and talk about just a little, which is containerized stock. Purportedly, people have found that you do have greater success under really dry conditions with containerized stock. It's not something I personally have a lot of experience with, nor do most of the folks at Mississippi State. It's just not something we've had to deal with as far as from a drought perspective and the impacts on bottom of hardwoods. But I will tell you that we've done a fair amount of work with containerized stock and comparing it to normal bare root stock, and even large container, small container, and bare root. And what we've found is there's not a lot of benefits to using containerized stock. Again, you do get that wider window of time, your wider window of planting that's available to you if you're going late in the year or early in the year. But if you match your species to the site, if you put them in the ground right, you use quality seedlings, we really have not found that to be the case. We just haven't seen that. There's another nail in the coffin for me personally when I think about should I plant containerized stock or should I recommend containerized stock versus bare root stock? And it boils down to I like to say there's 4 factors of consideration here when you're talking about whether or not to plant containerized stock. And it's expense, expense, and expense. And the 4th variable is expense again. You're talking about something that's going to cost you anywhere from a few $100s to several $1,000s in addition to what you would be spending on bare rootstock. It just doesn't pay. When you're talking about something that you're going to have to carry from a financial standpoint, you're going to carry that money into the future and hope to get an acceptable rate of return. You're talking about something that you're going to have to carry for a minimum on an excellent site, if everything works out, 55, 60 years, on up to 100 years if you're talking about some of the upland sites, maybe 120. You cannot make that pay, not without help from some of the incentive programs. So, well, even for containerized stock, probably not going to find that there. It's just not something that pays for itself, and we don't see a lot of biological reason for using containerized stock, unless you're in some situations that are very, very, very specific that we're not going to cover right here. Vast majority of the time, those aren't going to really going to be the case. Now, what does all that mean from a drought perspective? You know, how are we going to change our planting strategies in the hardwood world to counter the effects of drought as we move into the future? And it boils down to we don't know. Again, this isn't something that we really have any experience with. We do expect for some species to basically localize populations to narrow down. You know, instead of being county-wide, we may only be able to grow species X on the lowest portion of that county, or vice versa on the highest portion of that county. There's several factors in there that suggest that we would see some species move northern into range. Things like black cherry is one that some of the experts say we expect to possibly move north out of the state given time if we get into situations of increased drought and increased temperatures, but we don't know. We just don't have the experience out there. There's a lot of variables that play into it. Everything from drought frequency, drought severity, on down to changes in herbicide technology, changes in genetic material. Historically, we haven't had improved genetics in the hardwood world, but over the past few years, we're starting to see very few improved hardwoods come off the line. So there's so many variables, so many species. We're looking at somewhere around 70 to 75 commercially viable species of hardwoods in Mississippi alone. It's something that we just haven't got a grasp of. We don't really know what'll happen in situations where we do see an increase in drought across the South. We can make educated guesses, but we really don't have a good handle on that. That's kind of some of the areas that different researchers are working in right now, trying to figure out how to approach that problem as we move on into the future. With that, obviously we don't have time for questions with this particular presentation as it's a recording, but and my contact information was on at the beginning of the presentation. You feel free to contact me if you have any questions or any observations as far as that goes. And I hope to hear from some of you in the future.